area. So it gives me great pleasure to be here today to introduce Helena, who has come all the way from London and just landed this morning, didn't you? And Helena is here for the introduction of the 30% Club in Australia for the launch tonight and tomorrow, and we're thrilled to have her. I wasn't here at the beginning today, so I'm hoping we did a welcome to country, and I'd like to add my respects to the Gadigal people and to their elders past and present who are the traditional custodians of this land. My name is Patricia Cross. In addition to chairing the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation, I'm a company director and have served on various listed company boards. Current ones are Macquarie Group and Aviva PLC and the Grattan Institute. But really the big role lately has been launching the 30% Club in Australia, and it has been all the more enriched by the fantastic support of ACSI, especially you, John, and culminating in ACSI's announcement of their 30% target by 2017. To many, if not most of you, the 30% Club is now fairly well known in Australia because we've gone through a series of softly and gathering what we call a coalition of the enthusiastic. So no surprises, and we have a community-based support approach, very inclusive, many people very enthusiastic, and investors and the community at large especially are highly engaged. So it's my honor to be able to introduce Helena Morrissey. You'll see in the program there is a bio on Helena, and I didn't want to reread the whole thing to you, but I do have to say that I've got to know Helena better over the last couple of years, and I was always very impressed with her from afar because I travel back and forth between the UK and Australia a lot. And in addition to all these absolutely fabulous accomplishments, a fantastic investment manager, recognized as a great leader by many authorities, including Fortune magazine and Bloomberg Markets, chairman of the Investment Association, a huge investment managers association in the UK, and nine children and a Cambridge philosophy graduate. In addition to all that, I've really learned to look at Helena in a holistic sense, and I do believe that Helena is one of these genuine people that really gets it, that it isn't about all those little achievements. It's really about being a good person. And so I'm not going to say any more other than to introduce you. Thank you, Helena. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for an extremely kind introduction, Patricia. I'm very delighted to be here, not least, it was almost a near miss at 5 a.m. as we were just coming into land, when I thought, yeah, you got there. The pilot suddenly announced there was thick fog and he's probably going to divert to Melbourne. So I am really pleased that that didn't happen, and it is a great honour. Thank you, Patricia, for those very kind words. I hope that I'm not going to disappoint, not least because of the big build-up, but also because although I am going to talk about women and boards, I am going to talk more broadly about cognitive diversity and also beyond the boardroom, in fact, because I think that the women's issue is actually just a start, not the end, of a very big challenge for us as investors and as asset owners. We already heard from the preceding panel discussion about a whole area that I think lots of companies wouldn't even have considered on their radar screens even just a few years ago. And the fact is that the world is changing pretty rapidly, and it means that the role of shareholders and asset owners in terms of making sure that the companies we invest in are on top of the changes and are leading is quite a complex one. And I think that the Women on Boards thing is a sort of like an early indicator of lots of other things. Let me explain a bit more. One of the things that certainly been cited many times as a good reason why we should have more gender diversity on boards is to try to overcome the perennial problem of groupthink. I think most people think that groupthink means that lots of people sitting around agreeing with each other. And actually, the term, when it was first coined over 60 years ago, actually means something a bit more pernicious, really. It's when that the group becomes so sort of convinced in its own propaganda that it starts shutting out dissenting voices. Irving Janis later on, a couple of decades later, researched disasters in American foreign policy, unfortunately not the last disasters we ever had when he researched them, but he emphasized the fact that and I have to read it a little bit, the more amiability and esprit de corps there is among members of a policy-making group, the greater the danger that independent critical thinking will be replaced by groupthink. It shuts out the voices of those on the outside. Now, of course, I think we all are now convinced that groupthink had a lot to do with the financial crisis, but it's not the only time that this has occurred. Looking as I researched this, not just for this talk, but for others I've given about cognitive diversity, it's quite sobering to read the number of critical events in history that have really been effectively related to people wanting to shut out dissenting voices. The Columbia Space Shuttle challenge, reading through the investigation, it's really, it was already a tragedy, but it makes it seem even more difficult to understand when you see how there was this view which meant that those who disagreed just weren't heard. And of course, with tragic consequences. And then, of course, in the financial crisis, I think it's now well received that there's ability for people, governments, as well as boards, as well as investors, of course, to delude ourselves. And I like this bit, or although it's a bit, I don't know if I can say I like it, periodic bouts of euphoria that end in tears. Now, I have to say that Newton, the fund management company that I have the privilege of being the chief executive, is quite concerned about the long-term impact of quantitative easing. And it's one of the aspects of this that we worry about, that there is a conventional wisdom now that means that people who say maybe it's not going to keep markets afloat forever and a day, it's a challenge for people. People don't want to necessarily believe that there may be things that may go wrong. But I think we do have to accept the challenge. And one of the things about having the focus on women on boards is that we had this collective delusion leading up to the financial crisis. I love some of these quotes. It's a bit unkind what Lord Miners said, but he said, the typical bank board, and this was back in 2008, resembles a retirement home for the great and the good. And it was definitely a sense, particularly in the UK, that your glittering CV was what got you onto a bank board. Royal Bank of Scotland, at the time that it made the ill-fated acquisition of ABN AMRO, had 18 members of it on its board. 17 of them were men, and most of them had grown up in the same street in Edinburgh. The fact was that we just did not welcome a difference of views. Now, I believe that this has gone so far, and at the same time, of course, we have so much changing in the world, and I'll go on to describe some of the things that I think are changing, is that we need a revolution, not an evolution of the structure. Certainly, we need a revolution in terms of what it takes to comprise a great board that will oversee a management team. But we also need a management team that looks different than the past. We need to make sure that we engage all talent. And fact is that having, however brilliant a board is, then if they are the only aspect of the governance that has changed, then we're going to struggle to spot the difficulties. Now, as I said earlier, the focus on more women on corporate boards has been the start, not the end of the change. I will now depart from my broader script and just show you some of the stats that we have seen in the UK. Now, I know you've been making some progress here in Australia. I'm absolutely thrilled that we're launching a 30% club in Australia, and it's all thanks to Patricia and the team for working the audience so marvellously. And you have had some progress, but I hope that we can accelerate the change. Since 2010, the 30% Club launched in November 2010 when there were just 12.5% women on FTSE boards. It's almost doubled now, just under 24%. There are now no all-male FTSE boards. It would take just 17 more female appointments to get to the government's own target of 25%. We've got a little bit further to go to 30, of course. And then if we look at our next 250 companies by size, then we've moved from over half, 131 of them were women-free boards at the end of 2010. Now there's just 23. Obviously 23 too many, but that is massive change in quite a short space of time, particularly given the plateau that we'd seen for so many years before. But notwithstanding the impressive statistics, and of course this has been business-led change, this has not been through a quota, to be honest, the biggest change has been in the mindset. And during that rather short period of time, really, there has been an epiphany. There has been a realization among businessmen as well as women that this is their issue as much as a women's issue. This is no longer seen as a diversity issue, really, but it's just an integral part of having a modern, successful business. Now, the way the 30% Club works, I'm not going to use all my talk to talk about 30% Club, because I did want to talk about some of the broader themes. I'm very happy to talk to people afterwards, and I'm sure Patricia will be also delighted. And we can also talk about it in the question time. But really, the main things around it, apart from the leadership of businessmen and women, the members of the club, are the chairman, or in other countries, the CEOs, where that's the corporate governance structure. And they are the ones that are leading the charge and evangelizing about the issue and doing something about it. But it's also a very collaborative approach to work. So again, I know, as well as the fantastic support from ACSI, the AICD is very supportive, and there are many other organizations within Australia that are already doing fantastic work here. And part of the hope is that we can join together some of the fragmented activity and make it much more impactful by being joined up. What we have in the UK now is a series of actions right the way through from schoolroom to boardroom. You're not going to fix the boardroom in a sustainable way and a meaningful way unless you actually tackle every single part. I don't like to use the word pipeline particularly, because it implies that we're squeezing everybody through it. But try and create an ecosystem right the way through from our children through to nurturing them in a supportive environment at work, so that they can also contribute to the evolution of the culture. Of course, we've also had supportive public policy, and I have to say that's been incredibly important, perhaps something that we'll be able to discuss later. But what overall we've been trying to do is shift perceptions around what's normal. So instead of us sort of railing or being in any way aggressive or militant about, trying to fix something, what we've been trying to do is bring people to the idea that this is what they should want, this is what they do want. And it's changed things from being something of seen as a campaign to something more like, how do we just make normal change to create progress. Now, what we've seen is, of course, all the different component pieces. So yes, of course, executive search firms need to be on board to consider wider candidates they put forward to the nomination committees. The chairs of the nomination committees have to have a different brief that they give the search firms. And of course, investors need to be engaged to help to catalyze faster pace of change. I mentioned before that more women non-execs is not a panacea for all ills. I felt so strongly about the age thing, I've put it on twice on my slide, I see now. But one of the things, of course, is that we don't have enough young people on boards. Obviously, in a digital age, many companies are very cognizant that they don't have enough expertise around that issue on their boards, but still, it's a bit self-fulfilling. The criteria that are put forward for what makes a good board candidate often exclude younger talent. Educational backgrounds are often still pretty uniform. It's hard to find people with a different education background. And there's little sign of progress, certainly in the UK, for other underrepresented groups. Very few ethnic minority members of boards, for example. And most important and challenging, as I think, is that there's very little evidence that we see real disruptive ideas, real challenge being welcomed. Now, a few ideas that are being floated around include perhaps having a nominated devil's advocate on a board that obviously would have to be a rotating role, otherwise you'd be the most unpopular person on the board indefinitely. But a few people have said, yes, it's right, that we've sort of socially engineered it a bit. We've now had a few more women. We're now trying to broaden out our horizons as to other qualified candidates for the board, but actually we still want to generally have a very sort of fruitful dialogue when we're together. And we know we were too comfortable in the run-up to the financial crisis, and we probably are still only just shades away from where we were then. A degree of discomfort, a degree of welcoming left field thinking, I think, is quite challenging still to see. Now, where we also know is that we have a problem is that, when we look at the boards, it's just the reality is that finding people who can serve on boards is inevitably a small gene pool if we are going to take excellence and expertise and experience into account. Now, this is just a slide showing the proportion of women in financial services around the globe. This is 20 countries. PwC did this analysis a couple of years ago, but it hasn't changed much since then, I'm afraid. 60% of all employees of financial services firms around the world are women, but only 2% of CEOs. So again, my point is that it's no good us just looking at the boards. If we're really going to try and have a cultural shift, we have to look at all aspects, all levels of the companies. Now, one thing that sometimes gives people pause for thought, of course, is that we worry about making too much of a song and dance, about telling other people what to do to get their own house in order if our own house isn't in order. And this, I think, pertains when it comes to remuneration issues sometimes as well. Certainly within fund management groups, people are quite cognizant, certainly in the UK, that most of our publicly listed fund management companies have very few women on the boards. There are only 7% of the UK retail fund managers are women. Patricia mentioned I chair the Investment Association. There are 18 members of the board. There's one other woman. And if she's not there, it's a bit lonely. So, we know that we have more to do ourselves. One of the great things that I'm not claiming that all of this was thought through in advance, but turned out to be important part of the 30% Club, is that it's very much an aspiration. We would never have got off the ground if you had to have 30% women on your board to become part of the 30% Club. Like, nobody had 30% when we started. It's important, though, that we recognise that we have a shared problem. And one of the things we've been trying to do within the fund management community in the UK and beyond is to recognise that we have to start somewhere, and we might not be perfect, but getting out there and saying we are trying to do something about this around our own firms, but we also want you to do something about it, is the way forward, not to say we'll wait until we're sorted, until we go outside. Okay, so I wanted to spend a few minutes, if I may, about why I think it is quite important that we have diversity, and that it's not just a question of going through the motions and making the appearance of change. I do believe, and it's something I don't think we should ever be embarrassed about, that men and women are fundamentally different. We're biologically different. We bring different approaches to the way we think and behave. Now, this schematic is just one example. This is not my own work. This is the work of neuroscience called John Coates, who's at Cambridge University, Judge Business School. He wrote The Hour Between Dog and Wolf that you may have read. He was a Wall Street trader, and he has pulled together this schematic, really very stylistically summarizing the impact of testosterone on decision-making. Now, of course, one of the intriguing things about this is no one quite knows where to start in the circle. But if we start on the challenge point, and I just talk you through it so you can understand what I'm trying to get across here. If there's a challenge, it tends to increase the testosterone levels of people looking at the challenge as we try to work our way through it. Now, of course, women produce 1/10 of the testosterone daily that men do, so our increase is a lot less. As you have increased testosterone, that heightens your confidence. You take more risk. Let's say that risk pays off and you score a victory. That in turn raises your testosterone. A new challenge comes along, and you can see how you can go on and on and on until you sort of slightly get carried away. And that perhaps is a simple, but one way of looking at what happens, say, on trading floors if you don't have enough women, or what happened in the financial crisis. Now, I don't think women or men are better or worse than each other. It's just that we're different. Women also, our bodies react differently with the stress hormone cortisol. Women tend and befriend when we hit a problem. Men tend to fight or flight. And then, of course, there's broader other issues as well in terms of how we think and behave. There's another neuroscience, also at Cambridge University. His name's Simon Baron-Cohen. Yes, he is brother of Sasha. But that's slightly irrelevant to my point here, really. But I just thought it's an unusual name, you might wonder. Anyway, he has studied, really, he actually specializes in the study of autism, where there are more, obviously, boys that have autism than girls. And he published a book. It took him many years to pluck up the courage to publish the book. It's called The Essential Difference. He studied girl babies and boy babies, and this wasn't anything to do with social stereotyping. The fact is that girl babies look at faces for longer. Boy babies like to play with cars. And so it goes on that we just have the average male brain and the average female brain are quite different. We can share characteristics of each other. And bizarrely, 17% of us have the characteristics of the other, for what that's worth. But the reality is that women tend to be more empathetic and men more systematic. Women more consensus building, men more command and control. Now, these are just, say, scientific observation. I don't think we should be in any way ashamed or embarrassed about them. It's what makes the diversity work. I believe we complement each other. And of course, this is the start of differences. There are many other differences that we bring to the table, not just men or women, but from different education backgrounds, different ages, and so forth. Now, if you take one thing from my talk and look at something, I would commend you to read a Harvard Business Review piece. It's 3 pages long. It's called What Makes a Team Smarter? More Women. And it was a piece of research done by 2 researchers, as it happened, 1 male, 1 female. They ran a series of experiments. They set different teams, different intellectual challenges. Now, the intriguing thing was they tried single-sex teams. They tried teams made of very high IQ people, lower IQ people. The high IQ teams of either sex, single sex, scored less well than the lower IQ teams of mixed sex. And they didn't really believe the results, to be honest, and they ran the experiment all over again just to check. And actually, you had to keep adding more women in until you got to 70% women, but then my 30% club would not quite work. So anyway, we 30% the other way. But it's intriguing to read because basically they say, well, actually it's to do with how we operate in a group, how we behave together. Now it doesn't seem to me rocket science. That seems to be pretty obvious. Now, the world is becoming different. We already heard the talk about mental health and the challenges that we have. The 2 major indisputable trends of globalization and technology are giving rise to a third, and that is that our ability, the evolution of power is changing so that instead of it being top-down command and control power, then you gain influence through networks. And it turns out that women are more naturally, for the reasons that we went into before, hardwired to network, more inclined to build a consensus, more inclined to collaborate. So we have a little bit of an advantage as things develop, and the smart companies are getting this. Of course, we as investors want to invest in smart companies, but the problem is, and this is really the highlight, the final part of my talk, traditional financial analysis doesn't really pay much attention to this fact. We might sit in a room together and say how important diversity is, but actually when it comes to analyzing companies, certainly mainstream portfolio managers, not ESG specialists, are paying very little attention to this factor. I recently spoke in Toronto to the CFA Society. There are 250 people in the room, plan sponsors, investors, and fund managers, analysts, sorry. They asked the question, this was before my session, did you believe that having gender-balanced management teams and boards contributed positively to the financial performance of companies? 93%, and this was blind voting, this is one of those little voting pads, so you could have not chosen the politically correct answer. 93% of the people in the room agreed or strongly agreed, and the other 7% were neutral. No one disagreed. But actually then they asked the immediate follow-up question. We didn't all break for lunch and then come back and ask this question next. It was the immediate follow-up question, how many people factored it into their analysis? Only 25% said yes. Now, we're either completely irrational or we're just kind of a bit slow to wake up to this fact. I think that gives us a huge opportunity, but it requires that we think about this in a different way. What we're trying to do with the 30% Club Investor Group, one of the pieces of that wheel that I showed earlier, is to create a sort of sense of cohesion around the group to make sure that we do address this issue with companies. There are 23 members of the group. It is based in the UK, but there are global pieces of it developing. Total assets under management are over 12 trillion dollars, so a big group of assets. And then there are local initiatives developed within an overarching approach. So, for example, in the US, where there are no term limits, obviously, for directors, then that's a particular topic for the group there. So what we've been working on are best practice ideas for engaging with companies in a constructive way to start with, although obviously using voting where we're not seeing enough activity. You guys are ahead of us in many ways in respect of disclosure. We've been following you in terms of your if not, why not, and some of the emphasis on companies to disclose their data around this, but also having a dialogue to make sure that it's not something that then when we meet with the CEO, they say, oh, well, no investors ever raise this. Now, I know there are lots of ESG specialists in the room, so I'm not in any way undermining your contribution, but we need to move this from the ESG specialist areas right into the heart and soul of the investment process. It's only going to really make an impact, and I think it's becoming an urgent issue that we do for all the reasons given above, you know, that we are perhaps scratching the surface of moving away from groupthink, and I think we need to address it with more urgency. So what we're going to do here, what our hope is that as the 30% Club goes global, then by acting in, obviously there's a global shareholder register, by having a common approach, then we can amplify local efforts. Patricia is leading the club here. BlackRock will lead the shareholder group locally. Obviously what we're aiming to do is make sure that everybody is working on the idea that this is a business issue, not a women's issue. I have been incredibly impressed in the UK with just how quick people who sometimes were very skeptical to start with have moved on to realizing that this is the future, that this is what people are going to expect from the companies that they invest in, but also that they use as consumers. And of course, what we're trying to aim for are better boards, better companies, and better returns. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. We are going to open it up to questions in a few minutes, but I just wanted to ask a question myself. But prior to that, I wanted to say one of the issues, it seems, is the dissemination of the information so that we do get better engagement within investors and through all types of investors. The research is very compelling. Even recently, we had some more research come out in Australia where the Center for Gender Economics and Innovation did a study of the ASX 200 over the last 7 years, and they showed substantial outperformance on companies that had at least 25% women on boards. We do have 64 companies in the top 200 that have 25% women on board, so that's a good start. But if I think about the Credit Suisse 3000, which is research of 3,000 companies in 40 countries, that showed a significant difference in return on equity, total shareholder return, Dean, and price to book value, where you had more women on boards, and especially in the actual price of the company when you had more women in management, which is a whole other topic of conversation. So I guess my first question would be, what can we do to get those messages across in a way that engages both the investors and the community at large?
Well, I think, it is a challenge or somewhat of I suppose, an oddity, isn't it? Because everyone can see the data. And in fact, Julia Dawson, who wrote the Credit Suisse report, she was speaking at the same seminar in Toronto as me. Of course, we crossed the Atlantic, so we could hear each other speak. That was a classic, both from London. But her data, and she's fantastic about the way she presents it, because she comes across as absolutely disbelieving that on every metric, the companies with the more women would do better, and she sort of sets out to try and disprove it. Really, I think where this has to go back, which is why I was trying to pull it back a little bit from the whole issue just of women on boards, is I think it's all around human capital reporting, and I think that we struggle with anything on the intangibles. Certainly, accounting practices have, I think, struggled to keep up with the fact that intangibles account for so much of the value creation potential of so many companies now in the world. It's woeful, really, in terms of how far back it's gone. So it does help to also take it away from, for those people who are still, I wouldn't like to say sort of, retro, I'm going to call them anyway. Those people who are sort of retro about the women's issue, then to change it into much more around talent and how we are reporting on human capital as an asset, not just as a cost, and that's sort of where the discussion has got to, certainly in the UK, about how, and in fact the Investment Association's doing a big project on that now ahead of a conference that we'll try and do in November.
And we are seeing some good first steps in the UK, or secondary steps, I guess. ISS, for example, looks at diversity quite specifically. If you look at the comments on Aviva PLC, for example, there are comments. And AXA has it as one of their top 5 criteria. But what really interests me is how, and probably a lot of the people in this room, is how you better develop the transparency into what's going on within the boardrooms. So everyone knows that boards are implementing more rigorous board performance evaluation processes, but how do we as investors come to grips with the quality of the discussion that's happening around the board table? We had quite a big push by Richard LeBlanc in Australia about 10 years ago. So Richard's done a lot of work out of York University in Canada on personality types sitting around the board table, and he spent a lot of time in boardrooms. And that interests a lot of us as investors, but to actually understand what's going on in boardrooms and whether they all are smiling and patting each other on the back, whether they're just trophy boards, self-congratulatory, or whether they're really dealing with difficult issues and looking at things in different ways. How do we get a better feel for that?
Well, I think one of the things, certainly we held an event last October on the evolution of the board where we actually were quite self-critical or challenging over this point, that whether, again, we'd been slightly lulled into a false sense of security by having a few more women on board. We did have some people presenting from the board effectiveness review industry, and again, it strikes me as odd that companies wouldn't share some of those reports. It's not the norm. I know Dean is sitting here from the Ownership Matters. We are going to adopt the same board confidence index approach with a few local twists to it to again try to get the opportunity for investors to comment. But you're right. I think we just have to be demanding. I mean, I think ultimately the fact is that you all, own pieces of companies in the way that even management doesn't usually, and often we don't quite push that enough. We often, we can be, I think, more engaged, and I think that's the challenge for us, to recognize that, especially if we are joined up about it, then we can have a lot of clout.
Thanks, Helena. I need to tell you also that our CEO of AXI is a woman, Louise Davidson, and on the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation, we have 6 women directors and 5 men, so I'm not lonely.
Going to need a 30% club for men soon. But.
So we're doing what we can do. Can I open it up to the floor for questions?
Helen, your presentation could have won an award for the most stunning address immediately following an intercontinental flight.
Maybe the standard was low from what that might look like, but anyway.
I think we're fully well versed in the arguments, but you have presented them in such a compelling and brilliant way. Requisite variety in the boardroom has to occur and is occurring, and it's marvelous that it's being done so in this voluntaristic fashion now, where people are becoming convinced by the evidence rather than by some kind of notional ethical commitment. However, could all of this success have occurred so quickly without Norway and the 6 or 7 other European countries establishing mandatory quotas? And I know that all women directors in UK and Australia and elsewhere, where we've achieved it voluntarily, they certainly want that. They don't want the mandation. But it was that mandatory force in the background that really terrified the men into giving up their hegemony.
Well, it's one of those, because if I get me on the EU, we're going to be here all day. I think people have suggested that the threat of a quota, certainly from the EU, rather than, I don't think our government would have imposed it. I mean, Lord Davis, who wrote the review for the coalition back in 2011, he is actually a Labour peer, so it's a very much a cross-party review, and he told me that his daughter would have killed him if it recommended a quota. Anyway, but I don't think there's really been a threat from the local government, from our British government, nor would there be from anybody coming in. But the EU has definitely been a different matter. I think that actually it's funny though, when you look in Britain, it's very odd. We have this tendency to almost be in denial about any kind of regulation or legislation coming out of the EU until we actually have to implement it. So I think that the threat of that has not really been the driving force. I think it's been peer pressure, really. I think there have been, I wrote initially to, it was a slightly erroneous recruitment tag, having got some enlightened men to support the initiative to start with. I was then told that somebody was quite upset I hadn't invited him to join, so I started writing letters to all of the 350 companies. I started at A, I did it alphabetically and got down to HA for Hansen, by which point I was having a lot of hate mail back from the earlier letters in the alphabet. This was back in 2009, 10. And so quite a lot of those have come full circle, have joined it, have done things about it, have completely reconstituted their whole board, and recognise that the world's moved on. So I think that a lot of that was their peers, and the biggest success factor certainly for we've now have 125, so chairman supporters in the UK has been peers putting pressure on each other, and it's almost as if everyone kind of made a pact, they're going to move together. I would say one other big factor has been the media. And it's been unusual. The British press is not always the most sort of favourable on any issue, really. They like to run with something and then drop it, or be anti it after a while. But actually, they've all got behind this, and I think it's been generally regarded as a socially useful thing. which has been incredibly helpful. And I have to say that's been also added to the pressure if people hadn't felt the need to do it themselves.
Charles Masick, Professional
Hi,
Director
Charles.
and a former colleague of Patricia's on a board. Helen, let me add my congratulations to your outstanding address. I just have two questions. How do we ensure that this focus on gender diversity doesn't become the end game and rather becomes the start of a longer term evolution in terms of the broader diversity issue and the elimination of groupthink, as you've highlighted? And secondly, given the progress that has been made, albeit still with some further distance to go in terms of representation of women on boards, why do you think, and what can we do about the very low representation of women in very senior management ranks?
Okay, well, I think you're right to highlight the fact that gender diversity, could become, well, we've done that. We've got diverse boards, it's just women. There is a big effort now in the UK around ethnic diversity, and also for some boards they've made a specific request around or effort around age diversity that I mentioned. It gets harder because one of the suggestions that came out was that we would have a 20% goal for ethnic minorities. Now, only 14% of the British population are ethnic minorities, and then you end up with 30% women, 20% ethnic minorities. There must be an LGBT group, and then we're going to end up with, I said a board is not a boy band. I mean, it's, we've got to start, not end up with some sort of game that we're playing. So I think it becomes a little bit harder to develop the metrics. But I think it's really important that we keep talking about this being the start, not the end. And I think actually a chairman said to me the other day, which was generous of him, he said, well, actually what this has all done is it's opened up the cosy lid on board recruitment. That was just our friends, and we did just all call each other. I think we still have that problem in the UK around chair positions, I must admit. I don't think we've solved that one. But I think that's really what's happened here, that people are now saying, actually, I need international experience, I need someone younger, and so forth. On the women exec directors, of our percentages that we have here, it's about 29% of non-execs are women, and it's only 8% of the executive directors are women. Now, the reality is it takes, obviously, a long time to, as it were, grow a CFO or a CEO, and that's why almost all of the 30% Club's efforts in the UK now are on the pipeline. It's just that we're not complacent about the boards, but the momentum is there. And for example, the 30% Club chairmen speak in schools up and down the country. We have a program around universities. We offer business school scholarships. We have an early career strategy. We have a mid-career cross-company mentor program. It's kind of no stone unturned. And although lots of those efforts have been going on for many years, I guess what we're seeing now is an urgency about it to say, actually, we're pushing on a bit of an open door. Most companies are really desperate to attract and retain that female talent and develop it right the way to the top now. So I think one of my lessons over the last 2 years has been you can't really extrapolate the past. Something I'm a bit proud of, I've got to permit me to mention it. So Newton just sponsored the women's boat race between Oxford and Cambridge. Now, most of you don't probably know that the women rowed as well. It only took 186 years to get the women rowing on the same day, on the same course of the river. And obviously we didn't have TV back then, but covered by the BBC live. And of course, if we extrapolated the past, we would have said, well, we'll never get there. But actually, in just a couple of years, actually, from when Newton got first involved, it happened. And I think we're in that kind of 0 for 1 time now where companies are reassessing the criteria for promotion as well. So.
Oh, well, this is a short question. John Dawkins from CBAS. And from my own experience, I want to say that I agree with your central thesis. Can I just ask whether, on the question of testosterone on the one hand and consensus building on the other, and I know you're not saying that it's the responsibility of women to break up the old boys club or to break up groupthink, but could you just talk a bit about the disposition of women to build consensus as opposed to that of men to create fights, as it were? How does the consensus building, or how do you see the consensus building ability or disposition of women adding to the ability to bust up groupthink?
No, that's a good challenge. I mean, I think we definitely, as I was trying to say, need both sets of skills anyway. I think that the certainly, I mean, I'll speak from personal experience. So obviously I'm CEO of Newton, and all my senior colleagues are men, even though I've had senior colleagues who are women, but then we've sold part of the business that's been run by the women and so forth. And, you know, sometimes for me, and also that investment association board that I mentioned, where I'm very much a minority, it's hard to build a consensus if everybody else is slightly not thinking like that. However, I mean, I regard that as, you know, that is the lot, as it were, of the early women in these groups. And I guess I see that as a big challenge for me to convince other women who might say to me, well, actually, it's very hard when I get there. It's very hard to either lead or to challenge. I say, well, if you don't, nobody will. We kind of have to do it for the next, you know, to make it normal, to make it different. But I see the point. I mean, we have to be different and accept that we can't build a consensus necessarily when we have to make a challenge.
Okay, well, I think at that we're getting the wrap-up, time-up signal. I'd like to thank you again. Thank you again, Helena. Yes, please feel free to come up during questions. Great topic, lots to think about. Groupthink, it's in our sights, and I think that we're all looking forward to joining the revolution.